Hey guys, welcome back to the Becoming Brave study, awakening the courage that lies within. This week we are tackling the next definition of brave, which is to challenge. And when we say to challenge, we mean to stand up against injustice and to align yourself with God. I think this is probably one of the most well-known and widely accepted definitions of the word brave. When we think of brave, this is kind of what we think about. And even though, I wanted to explain the other ways that we are able to be brave in this world, this is one way that we are, created to do that. And so I wanted to take the lives of a few different women who did some pretty brave things to challenge, different people in the Word of God. But I wanted to show you that, they weren't just born this way. They really kind of went through a process of becoming these brave women that we get to read about in Scripture today. So the first person I want to talk about, of course, is Esther. So, we all idolize the story of Esther, and her bravery. She's the ultimate brave woman, kind of to a lot of us. But her secret was basically what led her to be able to walk into that throne room. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, because we can do the same thing in our lives today. So in Esther chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, but this is basically when Esther was going to go approach the king about Haman's plot to kill all the Jews. So on the third day, she'd been fasting and praying for 3 days. Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And that part kind of stuck out to me, that Esther had prepared. The king's basically like, "All right, bring Haman, let's go do this thing. I want to go eat in Queen Esther's, banquet." What did that mean? That means she had already prepared it, right? It was already ready. That feast was already prepared. She had spent the last 3 days fasting and praying to get God's direction. But what was she doing in the meantime? She was preparing the banquet. She could have walked into that throne room and died instantly. Basically, if you approached the king unsummoned, you basically died. Unless he happened to have favor on you and held out his scepter, which he did. But she didn't know that. All she knew is what God was asking her to do. So she went ahead and prepared for the success of her mission before success was ever a sure thing. Esther spent time with God to know what he was saying to her. She put her faith then into action by preparing for success, which gave her the confidence to walk into that throne room. She had done everything that she could do, and now the results were up to God. And I want to know, what dreams do you have that you're afraid to step into? It may not be, I got to go storm the king's palace, but, a lot of times God is just asking us to do something, and we're so afraid because we're not sure it's going to succeed. But Esther wasn't concerned about that. She basically knew what God was telling her to do, and then just went about it as if everything was going to go right. And I believe that that's what God is asking us to do. He's giving us dreams. He's giving us visions. He's giving us a course for our hearts to take. And maybe it's to stand up against something. Maybe it's to speak out against something. Or maybe it's to build something. But if you're so afraid of what the results will be that you never take that step, you're never giving God an opportunity to bring it to success, because he is the one who's going to bring success. Do you know why the king had favor on her? I'm pretty sure it was because of God, and Esther wouldn't have given God that opportunity to have that supernatural favor with the king if she hadn't have stormed in there and actually put action to her faith. And the next person I want to talk about is Hannah. And this girl is one that, her story is so close to my heart. And I don't really hear people talk about her story all too often. It's not, it's not Queen Esther, But I feel like this is probably something that most of us face, probably more than anything else. And so I want to read her story in 1 Samuel chapter 1, basically her husband Elkanah had two wives, her and a girl named Peninnah or whatever her name is. And she just sounds mean, doesn't she? And she was. And, scripture says that he loved Hannah, but his other wife had given him like 10 sons. I might be off, but she had given him a lot of children basically. And Hannah had no children. And it killed her because that was basically, a part of a woman, that was part of being a woman, especially back then. And so, she just felt so grieved, and this other wife would, tease her and taunt her and everything. And the Bible even calls her her rival. And so that's basically where we're at this time. And so in 1 Samuel 1, starting in chapter 1, verse 6, and her rival, the other wife, used to provoke her and grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. So this was years of her not having a kid. I mean, this would have been torture. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her, the other wife. Therefore, Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? And I thought that it was interesting that he said that because, he truly loves her. That's pretty obvious to see, but in that moment, Hannah had a choice. She could have settled for just his love, because he did love her. And in that moment, he was basically saying, am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? Why can't I be enough for you? But the Lord had really placed it on her heart that she would have a child. And she basically could have said, you know what, you're right, I'm being selfish. I should just be grateful for what I have. And there is something to be said about being grateful for what you have. And she was, but she knew what God had promised her. And she held on to that promise and she refused to give up. She refused to settle for what could be and held on to what God said he had for her life. And it goes on in verse 20, it says, and in due time, and I circled the words due time in my Bible because God's timing is not always our timing. And we need to remember that. But in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. And what book are we reading out of? 1 Samuel, because there's 2 books written on the guy, so he was clearly pretty important. But that never would have happened, I believe, if she had decided just to settle. You know what, you're right. You know what, I should just be content with this little life of mine, then I don't think she would have ever had a son. I think we have to play a role in God's plan for our life. We have to receive it. We have to walk in it. We have to take those steps of faith, give him something to work with. You know what I'm saying? And so, the enemy will often use the people closest to you to get you to settle for less than what he has for you. And it doesn't mean that those people are trying to make you settle. I believe her husband really loved her and was trying to just make her happy. He was tired of seeing her so sad and heartbroken. So he did truly care about her. And it's not like he was being demonic or anything like that. But, a lot of times it is very subtle. It's very subtle, and the enemy knows who to use. And even though those people might have good intentions for you, you have to know what God's promises are for you. You have to hold them close and cling on to his word and his promises tighter than anything else, right? And the next person I want to talk about is Rahab. So a lot of us know the story of Rahab, and so we'll kind of pick up in her story in Joshua chapter 2. Starting in verse 8, the spies, God's spies were sent into Jericho because they were going to attack the city because God had promised it to them. And so they came into this house of this woman named Rahab. And before the men, in verse 8, it says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land and that the fear of you has fallen upon us and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard now the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, and to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Sometimes you have to fight against an enemy king to align yourself with what God is doing. And I think that concept's kind of lost on us today. We don't really have, kings and kingdoms, at least not here in America, really. It's not something the lingo we're used to. But sometimes, think about the people that you're putting yourself under. Think about the people that you're around. Maybe you need to change your friends. Maybe you need to be like, okay, I need to align myself over here with what God is doing. I don't need to be out doing this. I don't need to be out, getting drunk, partying. I don't need to be out with these people. We, as Christians, sometimes we get this idea that we're supposed to evangelize the world by becoming like the world. And that concept is a complete lie, because when you start to allow yourself to willingly be involved in sin and rebellion against God, it doesn't lead to freedom, it leads to entrapment. And all of a sudden you're trapped in the very same thing that you're supposed to be inspiring others to get free from. And it's just a lie of the enemy to distract you, to get you off course. And it doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes. We all make mistakes. God does not use perfect people, and Rahab is the perfect example of that. She was a prostitute. You know what I mean? I don't know why. Maybe that was the only way she could make money. I don't really think the Bible's super clear on that. But it does say the prostitute Rahab. And I'm pretty sure that word means the same today as it did then. And so you don't have to be perfect to follow God. You don't have to never make a mistake. God is not looking for perfect people. He's looking for a willing heart. And you need to ask yourself, am I willing to align myself with what God is doing? If that means saying maybe no to other people, if that means saying no to being kind of over here in this area, I need to be over here aligning myself with what God is doing. And so I want you to ask yourself, what is God asking you to speak up for? It could be big, like something like Esther did. Maybe you feel called to end sex trafficking, but it could be something small, like maybe not gossiping about that person that everyone else gossips about, And I want you to ask yourself, where are you tempted to maybe settle in life? What are the things people are saying to you that cause you to start doubting God's vision for your life? And think about what those things are. And then, where do you need to take a stand for godliness? Maybe you need to get new friends. Rahab, she basically got new friends. They came in and destroyed the city, and her and her family were safe. And they aligned themselves with the people of God, with what God was doing on the earth at that time. Ask God for something in your life. Ask God if there's something in your life that isn't lining up. God, search me, search my heart, like King David asked. Is there anything in me that is not of you, that's not lining up with your word, and reveal it to me. There is a process to follow. These women they weren't just born brave. You know what I mean? And a lot of it is just spending time with God. You can't follow someone and do big things for someone that you don't know who they are. So just like Esther did in those times when she was fasting and praying and pursuing God for what to do, we need to be people who spend time with God, who spend time at his feet, learning from him and what it is that he has for our lives. And then we need to be obedient in the small things. It says in Luke 16:10 that who is faithful in the very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. And so many of us were like, I wish I could be like Esther, I wish I could just have the opportunity to do something big like that. Well, we actually can, because Esther put her faith into action. She was able to show bravery because she put her faith into action. She was able to show bravery in the throne room. And so many times we're asking God for our throne room experience when we haven't had our time of fasting and prayer. You know what I mean? It's like it's a process, and the decisions you make today are going to affect how you live tomorrow. They're not disjointed no matter what we think. We don't think, when I got married, I kind of had this idea that as soon as I said I do, I would just magically be like the best wife. I'd be super secure in my relationship. I'd be an amazing cook. I'd be able to juggle everything a wife is supposed to juggle because I'd be a wife, right? Well, that wasn't exactly the case. I woke up the next morning and I was basically the same person, and I had to learn. I had to actually take those steps and actually spend time cooking and spend time learning how to do things. And it's the same way with our faith. We have to spend time with God and spend time walking through that process of faith to where when we have our throne room experience, our Jericho wall experience, our Hannah moment, we can be ready. We can be ready to say yes to God, to not settle, and to align ourselves with His destiny and His purpose for us on this earth. And so, as we spend time with God and we begin to step out in faith towards the things that He's calling us to do, we'll go places, we'll do things, and we'll be a part of things that we never even imagined that we could do.